Marcus Wellington adjusted his silk tie one final time before stepping out of his Tesla onto the weathered dock. The morning mist hung low over the marina, but nothing could dampen his mood, not when he was about to deliver the killing blow. That would make him the undisputed king of Harbor Point's most exclusive waterfront district. At 62, Marcus had spent the last 3 decades transforming himself from a scrappy real estate hustler into the polished predator who now owned half the commercial properties along the coast. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian. Leather shoes gleamed despite the damp morning, and his smile carried the cold precision of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Today's the day, Harrison," he murmured to his assistant, a nervous 20-something who clutched a leather portfolio like a shield. "Today we finally get rid of that floating eyesore and turn this entire marina into the luxury development it was meant to be." The eyesore in question was the Serenity, a converted cargo barge that had been transformed into the most beloved floating restaurant and community center Harbor Point had ever known. For 15 years, Elena Vasquez had poured her heart, soul, and every penny she could scrape together into making the old vessel a place where working families could afford to celebrate life's moments, where local fishermen could grab a decent meal, and where the community gathered for everything from birthday parties to town meetings. But Marcus saw something entirely different when he looked at the Serenity. He saw prime real estate. He saw his crown jewel development, Wellington Harbor Estates, being held back by a stubby, rust-streaked barge that attracted the wrong kind of people to his pristine marina. The sound of laughter drifted across the water as Marcus strode. Down the dock, his footsteps echoing against the weathered planks. Through the large windows of the Serenity, he could see Elena setting up for the breakfast rush, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her movements efficient despite the early hour. At 43, she had the kind of quiet strength that came from years of fighting for everything she'd ever earned. She didn't see him coming. None of them did. Marcus had spent 2 years orchestrating this moment with the patience of a chess master. First, he'd quietly bought up the small marina management company that held Elena's lease. Then he'd systematically purchased every surrounding property, driving up the market rate for waterfront space. Finally, he'd pushed through a series of zoning changes that would make it nearly impossible for Elena to operate once her current lease expired. The coup de grace had come just 3 weeks ago when his legal team discovered a technicality buried deep in Elena's lease agreement, a clause about structural modifications that she'd unknowingly violated when she'd expanded the Serenity's dining area 5 years earlier. "Mr. Wellington." Elena's voice carried a note of forced politeness as she spotted him approaching. She stepped out onto the barge's deck, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, Marcus could see her morning staff, Maria, the grandmother, who made the best coffee on the coast, Tommy, the ex-Marine who worked the grill, and at least a dozen others whose livelihoods depended on the Serenity staying afloat. "Elena?" Marcus's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I trust you received my attorney's letter?" The color drained from Elena's face, but her spine remained straight. "I did. And I've been meaning to call you about that supposed lease violation. We can work something out." "I'm afraid not." Marcus pulled the eviction notice from his briefcase with theatrical flair. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The Serenity and all its improvements will need to be removed from my marina." The laughter inside the restaurant died as patrons noticed the tension on deck. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched Elena's hands tremble slightly before she clenched them into fists. "This is my life," Elena said quietly. "These people are my family. You can't just..." "I can, and I am." Marcus handed her the papers, enjoying the weight of the moment. 30 days, Ms. Vasquez. I'd suggest you start looking for a new location, though I doubt you'll find anything you can afford in Harbor Point." He turned to leave, then paused, unable to resist twisting the knife. "Oh, and Elena? Don't bother fighting this in court. I own the best attorneys in the state, and frankly, you can't afford to lose what little you have left on a hopeless cause." As Marcus walked away, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the dock with satisfied precision, he had no idea that Elena Vasquez wasn't the type of woman who gave up without a fight. He had no idea that she'd grown up in a family of engineers and boat builders, and he certainly had no idea that she'd been secretly documenting every shady deal, every bribed inspector, and every corners-cutting construction decision he'd made in building his precious Wellington Harbor estates. The war for Harbor Point was about to begin, and Marcus Wellington had just made the mistake of underestimating the wrong woman. Elena stood in the empty dining room of the Serenity at 3 a.m., surrounded by 15 years of memories and an ocean of legal documents spread across every available table. The eviction notice lay in the center like a venomous spider, but it was the stack of building permits, inspection records, and city council meeting minutes beside it that held her attention. Her younger brother Diego sat across from her. His structural engineering degree from MIT, making him the perfect ally for what she was planning. His laptop screen cast an eerie blue glow across his face as he scrolled through digital building plans, his expression growing darker with each page. "Elena, this is insane," he whispered, though they were alone on the water. "Wellington Harbor Estates isn't just cutting corners. They're playing hopscotch with building codes. Look at this." He turned the laptop toward her, pointing at a complex architectural drawing. "See these foundation pilings? The approved plans call for steel-reinforced concrete extending 40 feet into the seabed. But look at the actual inspection photos I hacked from the city database." Elena leaned in, squinting at the grainy images. Even to her untrained eye, something looked wrong. The pilings looked thinner, shorter. "They use substandard materials," Diego continued, his voice gaining strength. "Cheaper concrete, less steel reinforcement, and they only went down 25 feet. In an area prone to storm surge and soil erosion, these luxury condos are essentially built on matchsticks." Elena felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced since Marcus had delivered his ultimatum. How bad are we talking? Bad enough that the next major storm could cause catastrophic structural damage. Bad enough that if the right people knew about this, Wellington would be facing criminal charges, massive lawsuits, and complete financial ruin. The sound of footsteps on the dock made them both freeze. Elena quickly gathered the documents as a familiar voice called out, "Elena, you in there, honey?" It was Captain Morrison, a grizzled 70-year-old fisherman who'd been coming to the Serenity since the day it opened. Elena unlocked the door to find not just Morrison, but nearly 24 members of the Harbor Point community standing on the dock in the pre-dawn darkness. Maria, her coffee guru, stepped forward with a thermos and a determined expression. "We heard about Wellington's eviction notice. Nobody's sleeping tonight anyway, so we figured we'd come help you figure out how to fight this bastard." Elena's throat tightened with emotion as more familiar faces emerged from the shadows. There was Tommy from the grill, Mrs. Chen, who organized the monthly community potlucks, the Ramirez family who held their quinceañeras on the Serenity, and at least a dozen fishermen whose boats were moored throughout the marina. "You don't understand," Elena began, but Captain Morrison cut her off with a weathered hand. "No, Elena, you don't understand. This place isn't just your restaurant, it's the heart of this community. Wellington thinks he can buy us out, price us out, and push us out, but he picked the wrong fight." Over the next hour, as Elena's makeshift war room filled with coffee-fueled community members, she began to understand the true scope of Marcus Wellington's impact on Harbor Point. The stories poured out like a dam bursting. Mrs. Chen's family had owned a small grocery store on Harbor Street for 30 years, until Wellington bought the building and tripled the rent. The Ramirez family had been forced to move their fishing operation to a less convenient marina when Wellington bought their dock space. Tommy had lost his original job at the shipyard when Wellington convinced the city to rezone the waterfront for luxury development only. But it was Captain Morrison who provided the most crucial piece of intelligence. "My nephew works for the Coast Guard," the old man said, pulling out a battered smartphone. "He sent me this after he heard about your situation." The photo on his phone showed a sleek yacht tied up at a private dock behind Wellington Harbor Estates. Elena recognized it immediately. It was Marcus's pride and joy, the Wellington's pride, a 60-foot luxury vessel he'd been bragging about in the society pages for months. "So?" Elena asked, not understanding the significance. Morrison's weathered face cracked into a wolfish grin. "That yacht is registered as a commercial research vessel to avoid luxury taxes, but look at the dock it's tied to. Diego leaned in, his engineering eye catching what Elena had missed. That dock isn't built to commercial standards, and if that yacht is really registered as commercial, it needs to die. Rebecca Martinez hadn't slept in 36 hours, and her editor's coffee mug had become a permanent extension of her hand, but the story taking shape on her laptop screen was the kind that made careers. The Harbor Point Gazette's cramped newsroom buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt since the paper had exposed the mayor's embezzlement scandal 5 years earlier. "Elena, you need to see this," Rebecca called out as Elena entered the newsroom, flanked by Diego and Captain Morrison. The past week had transformed Elena from a restaurant owner into something harder, more focused. Her usual warm smile had been replaced by the determined expression of someone who'd found her purpose. Rebecca's desk looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Building permits, inspection reports, financial records, and photographs covered every available surface, connected by red string and post-it notes. But it was the headline on her computer screen that made Elena's breath catch. "House of Cards. How Harbor Point's most powerful developer built an empire on lies." "We go to print tomorrow morning," Rebecca said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and excitement. "But Elena, once this story breaks, there's no going back. Wellington will come after you with everything he has." Elena studied the evidence spread across the desk. Diego's structural analysis of Wellington Harbor Estates revealed construction defects that could affect hundreds of residents. Financial records showed a pattern of bribery and tax evasion stretching back years. The yacht registration fraud was just the tip of an iceberg that went down much deeper than any of them had imagined. "How deep does this go?" Elena asked. Rebecca pulled up another document on her screen. "Deep enough that the FBI might get interested. Wellington's been using shell companies to hide assets, bribing city inspectors, and falsifying safety reports. But here's the kicker. Remember that luxury development he built on Seashore Drive 3 years ago?" Elena nodded. The Seashore Towers had been Wellington's previous crown jewel, marketed as hurricane-proof luxury living. Hurricane Isabel last year caused over $2 million in damage to that building. But Wellington never reported it to insurance companies or the city. He just did cosmetic repairs and covered up the structural damage. Captain Morrison let out a low whistle. "People are living in a death trap." "Exactly. And if we can prove it..." Rebecca's eyes gleamed with the hunter's instinct of a born investigative journalist. The newsroom door burst open, and Marcus Wellington strode in like he owned the building. His usual polished appearance showed cracks. His tie was slightly askew, his silver hair less perfectly styled, and there was something desperate in his eyes that Elena had never seen before. "Rebecca Martinez," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand you're working on a story about my developments. I'm here to offer you an exclusive interview." The newsroom fell silent. Rebecca slowly turned in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Wellington, how did you know about my story?" Marcus's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Harbor Point is a small town, Ms. Martinez. Word travels fast." His gaze swept over Elena and her allies, especially when certain people are spreading malicious rumors. Elena felt her temper flare, but Diego's hand on her arm kept her silent. This was Rebecca's moment. Malicious rumors? Rebecca stood, matching Marcus's authoritative tone. "Are you referring to the building permits that show substandard construction materials, or perhaps the inspection reports that were falsified, or maybe the financial records showing systematic tax evasion?" For the first time since Elena had known him, Marcus Wellington looked genuinely rattled. "I don't know what fabricated documents you think you have, but I can assure you that Wellington Enterprises operates within all legal..." "The Seashore Towers," Elena interrupted, finally unable to stay quiet. "Tell us about the hurricane damage you covered up." Marcus's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, Elena. No idea of the forces you're playing with. Enlighten me." Elena stepped forward, no longer the nervous restaurant owner who'd been served an eviction notice. "Tell me about the families living in structurally compromised buildings. Tell me about the bribes you paid to city inspectors. Tell me about the yacht you're using to evade taxes. Marcus's composure cracked completely. You think you're so clever, don't you? You and your little band of misfits. But I built this town, Elena. I own this town. And when I'm done with you, there won't be enough left of your precious restaurant to use as driftwood. The threat hung in the air like smoke, but Elena noticed something that Marcus didn't. Rebecca was recording everything on her phone, and behind Marcus, Harbor Point Police Chief Sarah Williams had quietly entered the newsroom. Mr. Wellington, Chief Williams said calmly, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Would you mind accompanying me to the station? I have some questions about some anonymous tips we've received regarding building code violations. Marcus spun around, his face cycling through surprise, rage, and calculation before settling on his practiced politician's smile. Of course, Chief Williams, though I should mention that I'll be having my attorney present. That's your right, the chief replied. But I should probably mention that the FBI has also expressed interest in speaking with you. Something about federal tax violations and fraudulent maritime registrations. Elena watched as 20 years of careful reputation management crumbled in Marcus Wellington's eyes. The man who had strutted into the newsroom like a conquering general was now looking around desperately for an exit that didn't exist. As Chief Williams escorted Marcus from the building, Rebecca turned to Elena with the expression of pure professional satisfaction. Elena, I think you just gave me the quote of the century. I built this town, I own this town, recorded with multiple witnesses present. She grinned. Tomorrow's front page just became legendary. But Elena wasn't celebrating yet. Through the newsroom window, she could see Marcus in the back of the police car, and even at this distance, she could read the cold fury in his expression. A man like Marcus Wellington didn't go down without a fight, and Elena had a feeling the real war was just beginning. Diego moved to stand beside his sister, following her gaze. You know he's not done, right? Men like that, they don't just surrender. Elena nodded, thinking of the serenity and all the people whose livelihoods depended on it. Then we better make sure we're ready for whatever he throws at us next. Captain Morrison stepped up to Elena's other side, his weathered face set in grim determination. The whole community's behind you, Elena. Wellington may have money and lawyers, but we've got something he doesn't understand. What's that? Elena asked. The old fisherman's eyes twinkled with the same mischief she'd seen when he'd first shown her the photo of Wellington's yacht. We've got nothing left to lose, and everything worth fighting for. Elena woke to the sound of sirens at 4:47 a.m., 3 days after Marcus Wellington had been released on bail pending his federal hearing. She stumbled to the Serenity's deck to find the Harbor Point Marina engulfed in chaos, fire trucks, police cars, and Coast Guard vessels cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with their emergency lights painting the water in reds and blues. The Wellington's pride was sinking. Not just sinking, collapsing spectacularly as its hull split along stress points that Diego would later identify as catastrophic structural failure due to substandard construction materials. The 60-foot yacht that Marcus had bragged about, in society, magazines was now listing 45 degrees to starboard, its marble-appointed interior flooding with seawater that poured through gaps in the poorly welded hull. Captain Morrison appeared beside Elena on the dock, his weathered face a mask of innocence. Terrible shame, he said solemnly. Course, when you cut corners on marine construction, the ocean has a way of collecting her due. Elena looked at him sharply. Morrison, you didn't what? The old fisherman's eyes were twinkling again. Report suspicious maritime construction to the Coast Guard? File a formal complaint about potential safety hazards? Request an emergency inspection based on concerns about passenger safety? Elena felt a grudging admiration for the old man's tactical thinking. And the Coast Guard found? Hull welds that wouldn't pass inspection on a rowboat, engine mounts held together with hardware store bolts, and a fuel system that violated about 17 federal maritime safety regulations. Morrison's grin was positively shark-like. Funny thing about emergency inspections, they tend to be real thorough. By sunrise, the Wellington's pride was completely submerged, and Marcus Wellington was standing on the dock in a bathrobe and slippers, screaming at Coast Guard officials about compensation and lawsuits, while his lawyers frantically made phone calls. The man who had threatened to destroy Elena's life now looked like a drowned rat, his perfect silver hair plastered to his skull and his face purple with rage. But Elena knew this was just the opening move. Marcus Wellington didn't become Harbor Point's most feared developer by accepting defeat gracefully. The counterattack came that afternoon. Elena was reviewing the morning's receipts when her phone exploded with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, social media alerts, all pointing to the same devastating news. Marcus had called a press conference and the footage was SP,